I'm often asked what makes the difference between a good React developer and a great React developer. And while there are obviously many differences that could be highlighted here, from a skills standpoint, I can't think of any faster way to go from good to great than by learning and mastering some of the tools that belong to what's referred to as the React ecosystem. The React ecosystem consists of a number of very helpful tools such as Redux, Thunk, Reselect, and many others that greatly simplify the task of creating large, performant React applications. And these are exactly the tools that this course will help you learn and master. So who am I and why did I make this course? My name is Sean Wassell, and I'm a senior React developer. I've been working with most of these tools on a daily basis for the past few years, and have loved every minute of it, and now I'm eager to pass on my knowledge to other developers. Join me in my LinkedIn Learning course to learn about the many useful tools in the React ecosystem and see how to take your React applications to the next level. To get the most out of this course, there are a few things that would be helpful for you to know. First of all, it would be very helpful to have a basic knowledge of React. If you haven't already worked with React a little, I'd recommend you take a look at one of the React Basics courses in the library first, and then come back to this one, since we won't be covering any of the very basics of React in this course. It would also be helpful for you to have some experience with basic command line operations. All we'll be using for this course is basic commands like cd to change directories and ls to see the contents of a directory, as well as a few commands specific to Node.js. Keep in mind also that if you're on Windows, the commands might be a little different. I've left you a link to an article showing many of the basic Linux commands and their Windows equivalents. I highly recommend that you follow along with me as I write code, but I've also included the start and finish states for all the code that I write in this course in the exercise files for your reference. So basically, this course is intended for React developers who want to improve their development skills and the quality of their applications by learning to use a number of pre-existing tools in the React ecosystem. If you fit that description, then this course is definitely for you. We're going to start off here by installing the major tools necessary for this course, and that's Node.js and NPM. These will be really important for running our code and installing a few libraries we'll be using to make our programming easier. So if you don't already have these things installed, you can download the installer from Node.js's website, nodejs.org. All you have to do is pick a version to download, and then once it's downloaded fully, you just click on the installer, and it should take you through the steps required for installation. And if you're using Windows or a Unix distribution, these steps might be a little different, but Node.js's website has instructions for all of these as well. Once you've run the installer, you'll want to make sure that you have the most recent version of NPM installed. We'll be using a few libraries in this course, and NPM is a package manager for Node.js that allows us to easily install them. If you've ever done React development before, you've definitely used NPM. So to install the most recent version of NPM, just open your terminal and type npm install-g npm, and you might need to add sudo before this. And once you've done that, you can just type npm-v, and it should show a version that's at least as high as mine. Don't worry too much if your version is higher than mine, since everything should still run correctly in that case. And that should be all we really need to do right now. We now have Node.js and NPM installed. If you decide to use the exercise files that I've included to follow along with the course, there are a few things you should know first. The first is that the exercise files are organized by video. So for example, the code for video 7 in section 2 will be in a directory called 02_07, and this will contain both the start and end state of the code in that video. Now, assuming you want to run the code for that video, there's a few steps you'll have to follow. The first thing you'll have to do is open up a terminal inside the directory you want to run. So if we want to run the end state of 0207, we would change into that directory by typing cd 0207/end, and then once we're in that directory, we need to run npm install and hit enter, and that'll run for a few seconds, but once it finishes, all you have to do is run npm run dev, and the application should run successfully. Another thing to note is that if you pick up the course sometime in the middle during section 4 or later, there's a server that you'll have to run locally in order for the code to work correctly. This code is available for download alongside the exercise files, and in order to actually run this code, you'll need to run npm install in that directory, just like we did with our exercise files. And once we've done that, you simply need to run npm run start and hit enter, and the server should start up correctly. So that should be all you need to know to run the exercise files for this course. As I mentioned before, this course is aimed at React developers who have spent most of their time developing with vanilla React and are now looking for a way to more effectively manage the many different concerns present in a full-scale React application. Now, I firmly believe that this is an important step toward achieving greatness and, well, sanity as a React developer when working on large, complex React applications. So, my hope for this course is to give you solid experience with some of the most important tools in the React ecosystem. This course aims to help you make sense of the numerous and incredibly useful tools available to the modern React developer, learn how to use them correctly, and incorporate them into your React development environment. To do this, we're going to start off by creating a basic React application from scratch, and then use this application as a jumping-off point to learn about the many different tools that are available to us, including Redux, Thunk, Reselect, and styled components. We'll learn the basics of each of these technologies, such as how it works and why it's useful, and I'll walk you through the process of adding and integrating each one into your React project. And last but not least, because I'm a big believer in the importance of tests in any codebase, we'll see how to test all the technologies that we cover in this course. So by the end of this course, you'll have a fully functional React project that you can use as a reference for all future React projects that you undertake. You'll also have the understanding required to use each of these tools effectively to write beautiful, maintainable, and performant React applications, and skills that will help you excel in a corporate environment where such tools are used regularly. Well, I'm really excited to get started on this with you, so now that we have our basic plan of attack, let's jump right in. Before we get started learning all about the tools in the React ecosystem, it'll be helpful for us to take a good hard look at why we might want to make use of these tools in the first place. After all, these tools do have a bit of a learning curve, and to some developers, it might seem like they make the development flow, well, a bit more cumbersome than usual. So, as I mentioned at the beginning of this course, vanilla React, and when I say vanilla React again, I'm just referring to basic React without any of the additional tools that we're going to cover in this course. Vanilla React was designed as an effective way to create modular, performant user interfaces. And as I mentioned before, if we're talking about the model view controller pattern, React's main concern falls squarely into the view portion. That is, it provides a straightforward and powerful way to take some data and display it in the user's browser, as well as efficiently update what the user sees whenever the data changes. However, when it comes to how we load, store, and manipulate that data that we're displaying, React doesn't really provide us with much guidance. And this is actually somewhat on purpose. The idea behind this lack of opinion is that it allows React developers to make their own decisions with respect to the best way to load and manage data in their application, and tailor React to their exact use case. The problem with this, though, is that it requires a lot of thought and experimentation to get it right, and in practice, developers rarely put that much thought into making these decisions. The end result is that all this logic ends up getting crammed straight into the components themselves. This means that what we usually end up with in a vanilla React application are these huge, tangled components that contain all the logic for loading and managing their own data, and this can make your React projects very hard to expand and maintain. So if you've already put a lot of thought into organizing the code in your React project, and you've found something that works for you and your team, then you probably don't need all the tools we'll talk about in this course. However, if any of what I've mentioned so far in this video sounds familiar, and I've been at many companies where this is the case, so you're not alone, you'll probably benefit a lot from learning about the React ecosystem tools and incorporating them into your codebase. So then, as you may have gathered so far, the name of the game when trying to organize a React application is separation of concerns. In other words, if we can find a way to effectively identify and organize the many different types of concerns in an application, this goes a long way toward making our codebase more maintainable. This thinking, of course, is the basis behind patterns such as MVC, which I've mentioned already. And fortunately for us, a lot of thought has already been put into identifying and separating the concerns in React applications, and this has led to many of the ecosystem tools we'll be covering in this course. In fact, for most of the tools we'll look at, the underlying purpose for their existence will be this separation of concerns. So now that we know the basic benefits of using React ecosystem tools in our codebase, namely that they help us effectively separate our concerns, we'll see exactly how to do this in later videos, let's briefly go through each of the ecosystem pieces that we'll be covering later in the course. Keep in mind that the goal here is just to get a 10,000-foot view of each piece and how it fits into our codebase. We'll go into much more detail about each individual piece later on. The first tool we'll be learning about and incorporating into our codebase is called Redux. This is without a doubt the most popular add-on in the React ecosystem. Its main purpose is to help us manage the state of our React applications in an effective and relatively bug-free way. And to do this, it uses what's called the Flux architecture, a very fancy name for a pretty simple concept which we'll go into more depth on later in the course. The next tool is called Redux Thunk, or just Thunk by most programmers. What Thunk allows us to do is separate out the so-called side effects of our application. And side effects are permanent changes such as modifying user data on a server or upvoting an article, for example. And the idea is that this allows us to avoid putting this logic directly into our components. Again, separation of concerns applies here. Our components are meant to display our data, and that's it. They shouldn't be worrying about making network requests, and Thunk gives us a place to put this logic. Next up are selectors, and the specific library we'll be using for this is called reselect. While Redux takes care of managing and modifying the state of the application for us, the purpose of selectors is to abstract away the details of how our data is stored in the state. This will make more sense when we go in-depth with selectors later on in the course. And after that, we have what are called styled components. Styled components give us a nice way of, well, styling our components. That is, they give us a nicer way of managing the appearance of our components than using separate CSS files, particularly when the appearance of a component depends on the state in some way. Again, you'll get a much closer look at how this works later on in the course. To start off this course, what we're going to do is build a React project from scratch. That is, without the help of Create React App or other boilerplate generators. This is a good experience for React developers to go through at least once, since it gives a lot of insight into what goes on behind the scenes in a React app. And these are things that most developers don't ever think about. So, since this is not an introductory React course, I'm going to assume that you're already familiar with Create React App and might want to go a little deeper into the inner workings of a React project. Once we've built this rudimentary React application from scratch, we'll use it throughout the rest of the course to demonstrate how to incorporate each of the ecosystem tools and concepts one by one. So the first thing you might be wondering is, what do we actually need in order to create a React app from scratch without using a boilerplate generator? Well, the main things we need, each of which we'll cover in coming videos, are 1. An index.html file. This is what will be sent to the client and what React will render our app into. 2. We need support for ES6, since obviously we'd rather write our code using modern JavaScript syntax. 3. We need webpack. This will take care of the actual building our app, as well as allow us to use things like CSS modules to style our app. And we'll also use it to serve our app during development. The fourth thing we need is a root component. This is the base of our component tree. You can think of it as the container that holds the rest of our application components. And finally, the last thing we need is something called React Hot Loader, which will allow us to see the changes that we make to our app immediately in development without having to refresh our app every time. And that's really all we need. We'll see how to do each of these steps in the following videos. The first thing we have to do is create and set up the directory that will hold our React project. First, you've got to create a directory and call it React Ecosystems or something like that, like I've done here. And once you've done that, open up a terminal inside that directory and run npm init-y to initialize a new npm package. And that'll create this package.json file here for us. And if you want to initialize this as a new Git repo as well, now's a good time to run git init. And once we've done that, let's create two directories inside of our root directory. We're going to call the first one public. This will hold all the publicly accessible resources for our app, just like in a regular static website. And we're going to call the second one source, src. This will hold our actual React code. The next thing that we're going to do is create a file called Index.html inside the public directory that we just created. Index.html. This Index.html file will be what gets sent to the client when they send a request to our site. So what we need to put inside this file is a bit of very, very basic HTML that'll look like this. We're going to start off with the doc type tag at the top, and then the HTML tags. And inside here, we're going to have the header. And it's just going to have a few helpful things inside. So we'll say meta charset equals UTF-8. Meta name equals viewport. Content equals width equals device width, comma initial scale equals 1, shrink to fit equals no. Just some very basic stuff that you'll see in most HTML. And finally, the title tag. We'll just say React Ecosystems. That'll be what gets displayed at the top of the tab, of course. And that's it for the head. Now we move on to the body. And we're going to define a div here that's very important. It needs to have the ID root. And this is the div that React will eventually render our app into. We'll see how to do that really soon. And then we usually include a noScript tag, just in case the user has JavaScript disabled in their browser. We say something like, please enable JavaScript to view this site. And last but not least, we need a script tag down here to load our React code. We're going to say script source equals, and then /dist/bundle.js. And note that this bundle here doesn't exist yet. We're going to get to that in just a minute. So make sure to save your file, and that's all we need for our index.html file. It's pretty boring, isn't it? All the magic is going to happen in our React code. But first, in order for our React code to actually work, we'll need to add support for ES6. So we're going to be writing our React code using ES6 syntax, and we're also going to need to add support for JSX, React's special HTML-like syntax for defining page layouts. And in order to do all this, we're going to start off by opening up a terminal inside our directory and running npm install --savedev at babel/core at babel/cli at babel/preset-env and at babel/preset-react. And then we're going to hit enter. And that might take a little while to run, but once it does, the next thing we need to do is create a babel.rc file. This file will tell the Babel transpiler what presets and plugins to use to transpile our code. So let's create this babel.rc file in the root of our directory. Call it .babel.rc, don't forget the dot before it. And inside this file, we're going to define a JSON object, and this object will have a property presets. That will be an array of 2 strings. The first one's going to be babel preset-env, which handles the transformation of ES6 into CommonJS, and babel/preset-react, which knows how to deal with JSX properly. Babel will use both of these presets to transform our code into something the browser can run. Although, just as a side note, most modern browsers now support ES6 syntax, so this isn't as necessary as it once was. And that's it for now. Let's make sure to save this file, and we'll see later on how to actually use Babel to transpile our code using the presets we've defined here. Now that we've got support for ES6 and React syntax, although we still have to actually build and serve our project, we'll see how to do that in a coming video, we're going to create 3 files inside of our source folder. This is the first actual React code that we're going to write here. The first file that we're going to create is going to be called Index.js, and this will contain the code that inserts our React app into our index.html page. And then we're going to create 2 more files, one called app.js, and the other called app.css. And these 2 components will contain the code and the styling, respectively, for the root component of our application, which for now will be the only component in our application. So we're going to code this component first, open up app.js, and we're going to write the following code. We're going to say import React from React, and then import app.css, and then we're going to say const app equals, and we're going to make this a functional component here. And for now, our component is just going to be a simple div. We'll say class name equals app, so that we can add styling later on. And then we'll say h1 hello world. Nothing too complicated here right now. And finally, down at the bottom, we're going to say export default app. And now let's move over to our app.css file and just add in some very basic styling. It doesn't have to be anything too complicated. So we'll say .app, and we'll give it a margin 1 rem, font family, we'll say Arial, Helvetica, sans serif, and we're going to say color. We'll just say 222222. So that's our very basic React app so far. The only thing we have left to do is write the code that will actually render our app component that we just created into the index.html page that we defined. So here's how we do that. We're going to open up the index.js file that we created, and we're going to add this code into it. We'll say import React from React, import React DOM from React DOM, and finally we're going to say import app from app.js. And down here is where the actual rendering is going to take place. What we're going to say is React DOM.render, and we're going to render our app component into document.getElementById root. So we're going to be finding our root div that we defined in our index.html and rendering our app inside that. And last but not least, we have to actually install React and React DOM, these two packages we're using up here, so that we can use them in our app. So we'll say npm install React and React DOM. And that's all we need for now. The only thing we have left to do is set up Webpack to build and serve our project for us. So now that we've got a very simple React app set up, we need to set up Webpack to actually build our app. And what we're going to have Webpack do for us is take the code in our source directory and perform some operations on it, like converting the ES6 syntax and JSX to CommonJS, and then host our public directory so that we can view our app in a browser. Before we get started, let me just say that this is probably the least fun part of the whole process, especially if you're not familiar with Webpack. But bear with me, I'll explain everything that goes into our Webpack configuration and how it helps us. So the first thing we're going to do is install all of the packages that we'll need. So open up a terminal in our React Ecosystems directory here, and type npm install --save dev webpack, webpack CLI, webpack-dev-server, style loader, CSS loader, and finally Babel loader. And we're going to hit enter and run this, and that's going to take a little while. And before we go on, if you really want to make sure that you're getting the correct versions of the packages we just installed, especially Webpack, you can take a look at my versions in the package.json here. If you find that Webpack isn't quite behaving correctly for you, you can always specify the versions that I have here, and it should work exactly as it did for me. So the next thing we're going to do here is create our Webpack config file that will allow us to define what exactly we want Webpack to do with our source code. So we're going to create a file in our base directory here, and call it webpack.config.js. And then inside this file, we're going to write a bunch of code. So again, bear with me here. So first we're going to import a few things, path and Webpack. And note that since Webpack will be the thing that's actually transpiling our code from ES6 to CommonJS, the Webpack code itself is usually written in CommonJS. So that's going to look like const path equals require path, const webpack equals require webpack. And now we'll define our only export, which will be a JavaScript object that contains a bunch of configuration data for Webpack. So we'll say module.exports. Again, this is ES5 syntax here. And first we have to define our entry point for Webpack, which will be the Index.js file, since that's the one that imports all the others. /source/index.js. And we're going to specify the mode, and we'll have Webpack in development mode here. And now we have to specify the rules for exactly how we want Webpack to transform our code. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with Webpack, Webpack does this by using what are called loaders, basically packages that Webpack uses to transform code in some way. So for example, the first rule we'll define will be to transform our ES6 code to regular JavaScript, and that'll look like this. We first have to define a module property, and that's going to be an object. And then inside here, we need a property that's called rules, and that's going to be an array. And the first rule here, as I said, will be to transform our ES6 code to regular JavaScript. And I'm not going to go into too much detail here again, but this will just have a property test, and it's a regular expression, so / / dot parentheses JS pipe, JSX, $, /. Don't worry if that doesn't make sense to you, that's just matching all of the JS and JSX files. And we're going to say exclude /node_modules, because we don't want it to look inside our node modules folder. And then the loader we want to use is our Babel loader. And finally, we want to specify options, and that's going to be an object that says presets, Babel, /env. And that's it for that rule. Next up, we're going to add the style loader and the CSS loader, and that allows us to do this thing where we import a CSS file at the top of our React components, like we did in app.js. We have to remember to add a comma up there. And then we're going to say test / /\.css, $, comma, and then we're going to say use style loader and CSS loader. And that's it for our rules. The next thing we'll add to this conversation is the resolve property, and make sure you add that outside of here. We're going to say resolve. So we've got our React app up and running, which is great. But the problem, and granted it's not a big problem by any means, but still, the problem is that whenever we make a change to our code, for example, if we were to open up our app.js component and add some exclamation points, we have to physically refresh our browser in order to see the changes. And this is something we can fix pretty easily. Let's see how. So let's open up another terminal on our directory. I usually just leave Webpack dev server running in the background. And we're going to run npm install save dev react hotloader and hit enter. And once that installs, we're going to open up app.js and add two little things. So first, at the top here, we're going to say import hot from React hotloader. And then at the bottom, instead of just exporting our bare app component that we defined, we're going to say export default hot parentheses module, and then parentheses around app as well. And this will allow us to see any changes that we make to our app without hitting refresh in our browser. We'll see that in a second. First, in order to avoid having to remember and type out our Webpack dev server command every time, let's define an npm script for it. To do that, just open up package.json, and right above our test script here, let's define a new script called dev, and then inside it we'll put our Webpack dev server command. So we'll say npx webpack dev server -- mode development, comma, don't forget the comma there. And now all we have to do to run our app is type npm run dev and hit enter, and it'll build and serve our app for us. And note also that we can make changes to our app now, and we'll see them show up immediately without refreshing. And one more thing to note here is that while we're running our Webpack server, there isn't a dist folder as we might expect. That's because what Webpack Dev Server does is holds this dist folder in memory and serves it, and then deletes it when we stop it. If we want to actually build our React app so that we can see the files, what we can do is open up our package.json file and create another script in here called build. And then instead of running Webpack Dev Server, we can simply run Webpack. So npx webpack -- mode development. And don't forget a comma after that as well. So now we can run npm run build. And we see that our dist file with all of our transpiled code shows up right in here. But I'm going to delete that because we don't need that for now. So now that we've built ourselves a working React app from scratch, it's time to take a look at the application we're going to be building throughout the rest of the course. The app that we're going to be creating, as is pretty typical with many courses, is a basic to-do app that keeps track of things that we want to get done. So our app is going to allow us to create new to-do items. It's going to allow us to mark these to-dos as completed. And finally, it's going to allow us to remove these to-dos. Now, this might seem like kind of a simple app, but I've found that it's a very good way to demonstrate how to add different React ecosystem components to a React application. So, without further ado, let's get started with building the very basics of this app, and then later on, we'll use the ecosystem pieces to add more and more functionality to it. Okay, so the first component that we're going to create for our app is the to-do list component. And this is going to be pretty straightforward. The first thing we're going to do is inside our source directory, we're going to create another folder, and we're going to call it to-dos. And inside this folder, we're going to create a file called todoList.js. And from here, our to-do list component is going to be a pretty straightforward React component. We're just going to say import React from React, and then define our component. We'll say const todoList equals, and then its only prop for now is going to be the to-dos that it's supposed to display. And what it's going to do is inside a div with the class name listWrapper, it's going to simply take the to-dos that it gets as a prop and say todos.map. And for each to-do, it's going to display a todoListItem component. We'll create that in the next video. todoListItem. And the prop it's going to pass is the to-do that we're mapping. To-do equals to-do. And finally, at the bottom of this file, we're going to say export default to-do list. And up at the top, we're going to say import todoListItem from /todoListItem. And this file doesn't exist yet, but we're going to create it really soon. And that's our component, plain and simple. The only other thing we're going to do is create a CSS file for our to-do list. And since this isn't a web design course, I'm not going to do any styling here. If you want to style these components, feel free to do so, or just use the styling found in the exercise files. So now that we've implemented our to-do list component, the next thing we're going to do is implement this to-do list item component to display the individual to-dos. And in order to do that, we're going to go through pretty much the same flow that we followed to create our to-do list. We're going to create a new file inside this to-dos directory that we created. We'll call it todoListItem.js, and we'll create todoListItem.css as well. Although we're not going to do the actual styling in this video, you can look at the exercise files if you want to take the styling out of there. And for this component, we're going to say import React from React, just like we do with all our React components. And we're going to define our actual todoListItem component. We'll say const todoListItem equals, and then its only prop for now is going to be a single to-do that it displays. And then for the JSX for this component, we're going to have a div with the class name todoItem container. And inside here, we're simply going to display the to-do's text property. So we'll say todo.text. And then we're going to display two buttons, one for marking a to-do as completed, and one for removing a to-do from our list completely. So we'll say button, mark as completed, and button, remove. And we're going to put these buttons inside their own div, just for styling purposes later on. And we'll give this div the class name buttonsContainer. And we'll give this button the class name completed_button and remove_button. So for now, that's it for the internals of this component. It's nothing too exciting yet, and that's where our ecosystem tools will come in. So at the bottom, let's say export default, todoListItem, and that's it for now. Okay, so far we have our to-do list and our todoListItem components. The next and final component that we're going to add is the newTodoForm component. And this is a component that our users will be able to use to create new to-dos. So it'll have a text input as well as a button. So first, let's create our new files. We'll say newTodoForm.js and newTodoForm.css. And it's going to be very similar to our other components, where we say import React from React. And then we're going to define our component, const newTodoForm equals, and for the time being, this component isn't going to take any props, although it'll definitely get some later on in the course. And now for this newTodoForm component, we're going to have a div with the class name newTodoForm, and it's going to have an input. We'll say type equals text, and we'll add more to this later on, but for now this is all we need. And we're going to have a button with the text create to do. And we're going to want to add class names to these as well. Class name equals new to do input, and class name equals new to do button. And we're going to export this component, just like our other ones. Export default, newTodoForm. And for this component, what we're going to want to do is add state to keep track of the current value that's contained in our text input here. So in order to do that, we're going to import useState from React. If you're not familiar with this, this is a React hook. But don't worry about the details right now if you haven't seen it before. So in order to keep track of the value in our input box, we're just going to say const brackets input value set input value equals useState, and then an empty string. And the way we're going to use this is with our input element here, we're going to set its value equal to input value. And for its onChange function, we're going to say that we should set the input value to whatever the new value of the text input is. So e.target.value. And last but not least, we're going to want to have a placeholder there. So we'll say placeholder equals type your new to do here. And that should be all we need for our component right now. The last thing we're going to do is just make sure to import our CSS for this component. So we'll say import newTodoForm.css. And let's go back and do this for todoListItem. Import todoListItem.css. And we'll do it for our todoList component as well. Import todoList.css. Okay, so now that we have our todoList, todoListItem, and newTodoForm components created, there's just two more things that we have to do before we can run our app and see these new components in action. The first thing we have to do is open up our app.js component, and instead of displaying hello world here, we're going to display our to-do list that we created. So in order to do that, we just have to say import to-do list from ./todos/to-do-list, and then replace this with to-do list. And then we're going to open up our to-do list and add the newTodoForm component at the top of that. So we're going to say import newTodoForm from ./newTodoForm and put that at the very top here. And in order to prevent our app from getting an error, we're going to have a default value for our to-dos prop here. And that should be all we need for now. If we run npm run dev and open up our app, we see that it's definitely displaying the newTodoForm, but since we don't have any actual to-do items in our application, it isn't displaying anything for that yet. Oh, and if you're wondering why the app looks so fancy, that's because I added in the styling that you can find in the exercise files. So in order to just get a taste of what our app is going to look like, let's add an object to this default value here, and it'll have a text property, and it'll just say hello. And if we go back to our app now, we see that this is now displayed as a new to-do item using our todoListItem component that we created. And that's all we have to do for now. Obviously, these components aren't exactly functional yet, since we haven't hooked them up to anything. But throughout the coming chapters, we'll see how we can use the React ecosystem tools to bring this application to life.